First tonight, the family of Heather Elvis is speaking out after one of two people convicted in the kidnapping of Elvis wants a new trial. Sidney Moorer was first found guilty of obstruction of justice in September 2017 before being found guilty.
Darkness, water, fog low over the Wakamoe River. A car, parked alone at a boat landing. The doors are locked. The keys are gone. So is the young woman who drove it there.
Terry, what did you find when you got here?
I came with the officer to identify the car and to open it for him. I had the spare keys to it. We have spare keys to all of our cars, locked up at home. So we got here, we found the car, we opened the car. The officer went through it, and he found receipts, time-stamped earlier that day.
No struggle, no note, no sign anyone was ever here at all. Just an empty car, a quiet ramp, and the water beyond it. The last place Heather Elvis is known to have been. She was 20 years old, and in December of 2013, she disappeared so completely that, more than a decade later, investigators still cannot say with certainty what happened to her in the dark, in the cold, in the 12 minutes before that car went silent. This is the story of what they could prove, and everything they couldn't. Before any of that, before the calls, before the payphone, before a boat ramp became the last known place she'd ever been, there was simply a family.
She loved working. I don't know what it was about Heather, but work was her driving force. But her passion was doing makeup. She was very artsy, and that's what she really loved.
Terry Elvis, Debbie Elvis, their daughter Morgan, and Heather, the middle piece of that family, the kind of daughter who still called home, still argued with her sister, still had a life that hadn't finished shaping itself yet. She'd graduated from St. James High School in 2011. By the time she disappeared, she was working two jobs, as a waitress at the Tilted Kilt in Myrtle Beach and at the House of Blues, while training in cosmetology. She'd just been offered a position as a makeup artist at a local salon, set to start the week of Christmas. She had a small collection of tattoos that would later appear in missing person bulletins alongside her photo. A compass rose on her forearm, a sea turtle on her side, a small wave on her wrist.
First tonight, the family of Heather Elvis is speaking out after one of two people convicted in the kidnapping of Elvis wants a new trial. Sidney Moorer was first found guilty of obstruction of justice in September 2017 before being found guilty.
Online, she was funny, a little unfiltered, the kind of young person who narrated her own life in real time, including that June, a joking tweet about developing a taste for older men. She had no idea yet how much weight that joke would eventually carry. That, though, was still 6 months away. On the night of December 17, 2013, none of it had happened yet. Heather went on a first date that evening, an attempt, by most accounts, to move forward after a relationship that had ended weeks earlier, with a married man named Sidney Moorer. Her date dropped her off at her apartment around 1:15 a.m. She was home. She was safe. For a moment, this could have simply been an ordinary night. At 1:44 a.m., her phone lit up. She called her roommate, Brianna Bree Worrelman, who was out of town visiting family, to talk through how the night had gone. The call lasted about 10 minutes. The last thing I told her was to not meet Sidney, Worrelman would later testify. Go to sleep and we would talk about it in the morning. Heather did not take that advice. What happened over the next few hours would later be pieced together almost entirely from phone records. A trail of minutes and numbers that investigators, and eventually two separate juries, would have to interpret without a single eyewitness to any of it. It starts with a payphone, a gas station in Socastee, just past 1:44 in the morning. A man walks up to a payphone, a relic even in 2013, that offered exactly one thing a cell phone couldn't. No name attached to the number. He picks up the receiver. He dials. The security camera outside is running the whole time. Sidney Moorer would eventually admit, after first denying it to police outright, that the man on that video was him. Heather tried calling that payphone number back. Once, no answer. Again, nothing. A third time, at 3:17 a.m., the two finally connected directly. And somewhere between 3:25 and 3:37 a.m., a window of just 12 minutes, Her phone activity suggests she walked out of her apartment and into the cold. 8 miles away, on the Waccamaw River, a homeowner's security camera caught something passing in the dark. A pickup truck, black, rolling past Peachtree Landing at roughly 3:30 a.m. Prosecutors would later argue it was Sidney Moorer's Ford F-150. At 3:41 a.m., Heather placed one final call. It went to Sidney. It was the last known contact anyone would ever have with her. By 6 a.m., her phone had gone silent. It has never turned back on. 2 days later, on December 19th, Terry Elvis reported his daughter missing. Police found her car exactly where it had been left. Alone in the Peachtree Landing lot, doors locked, license inside, no sign anywhere of the young woman who'd driven it there.
And it says, "Look at me, I'm a pro."
It means a mother's worst nightmare, Debbie Elvis would later say of that discovery. What followed was one of the largest volunteer search efforts the Grand Strand had seen in years. Dive teams went into the Waccamaw. Helicopters passed low over the tree line. Boats moved slow along the current, looking for anything.
She had a wonderful life. She had a beautiful life. She lived it the way she wanted. She made her choices the way she wanted.
We've always been a tight-knit family. Everybody does for everybody else.
The CUE Center for Missing Persons, based in Wilmington, joined the search the following day. By early January, hundreds of volunteers were turning out for single-day searches. K-9 units, horseback riders, ATVs combing the woods and ponds around Socastee for hours at a stretch. The reward climbed from an initial $1,000 to $20,000, then $25,000, as the story went national. On January 6th, the Nancy Grace Show on HLN devoted a segment to the case. Not every discovery brought answers. On December 28th, a volunteer helping search Tidewater Road found human skeletal remains, later determined to belong to an unrelated man in his 20s. Not Heather. It was one of several false leads that would surface and dissolve over the following 2 years, including a set of remains found in Florida in early 2014 that also turned out not to be hers. "That is gone from his eyes. It's just empty darkness now," said Bradley Parker, a family friend who'd grown up attending church with the Elvises, describing the change he saw in Terry. "Until they bring their daughter home, it will never be over," said Julie Daft, one of the volunteers who kept searching.
Tried calling her at that point?
Oh, yes.
Over and over.
We call over and over and over, and it went straight to voicemail
every time.
Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Back at the Elvis house, small things had simply stopped moving. The Christmas gifts Heather had already bought and wrapped that December sat where she'd left them. Her room stayed exactly as she'd walked out of it. The makeup artist job she'd been so excited about, the one set to start that same week, never got a first day. 20 years old. A phone call to her roommate. 12 unaccounted for minutes. And then nothing. CTA. Somewhere in that widening search, investigators had already started asking a very different kind of question. One that had nothing to do with a stranger at a boat landing at 3 a.m. It had to do with the man on the other end of that final call. And a wife who, weeks earlier, had found out about him. Subscribe to Criminal Instincts with S-Day. Act 2 goes inside the affair investigators believe started all of it. To understand what investigators believed happened at Peachtree Landing, the story has to rewind several months. Past the search parties, past the missing person flyers, back to an ordinary restaurant kitchen and a routine maintenance call. Sidney Moorer, then 37, spent his days repairing kitchen equipment at restaurants across the Myrtle Beach area, including the Tilted Kilt, where Heather worked the host stand. He was married, with 3 children, to a woman named Tammy Moorer, and had been for nearly 20 years. Heather noticed him almost right away. In June 2013, she tweeted about it herself, a joke about a taste for older men. Months later, prosecutors would read that joke back into a courtroom record as evidence of exactly when this began. By July, according to court records, the two were involved. It wasn't especially hidden. 2 of Heather's co-workers, restaurant manager Jessica Cook and colleague Jody Davenport, later testified that the relationship was common knowledge at the Tilted Kilt, that Sidney would regularly bring Heather coffee and bagels and stop by to see her during her shifts.
I don't know what it was about Heather, but work was her driving force. But her passion was doing makeup. She was very artsy, and that's what she really loved.
In September, Heather posted something else online. A short, almost literary line about an angel and a devil falling in love, and how it hadn't ended well. Prosecutors would later use her own social media trail extensively to reconstruct this relationship, month by month, in front of a jury. Then, on November 2nd, someone else found out. Tammy Moorer discovered the affair that day, according to the South Carolina Court of Appeals' own summary of the case. And what happened next didn't stay contained to a private conversation. Court records show she took control of Sidney's phone that same day. According to cell phone data later entered into evidence, she began accompanying him on his maintenance rounds around Myrtle Beach, and, investigators would allege, began watching Heather herself. She reached Heather directly, too. Phone records preserved one message in particular. "Save yourself," it read. "I'm giving you one last chance."
Fair Services, it sounds like a lot of people are going after Tammy Moorer and Sidney Moorer. On social media, it's a storm. Of course, our system works, you're innocent until proven guilty, and a lot of people posting these people are.
Bree Worrellman would later testify that the confrontation left Heather visibly shaken. From there, according to multiple outlets, it escalated. Repeated calls to the restaurant, hostile posts online, at least one message describing Heather in vulgar terms. But something else had started, quietly, in those same weeks. Something Heather's co-workers began to notice. Cook, who oversaw staff uniform orders, testified that Heather had gone up several sizes. Concerned, Heather took a pregnancy test at work. The result, according to testimony, came back as an error message, not a clear answer either way. Then, on the very morning Heather disappeared, a Walmart security camera caught something. Sidney Moorer buying a pregnancy test of his own, and a cigar. Minutes later, his phone dialed hers. It would be the last call Heather Elvis's phone ever recorded receiving. To prosecutors, that single purchase, timed exactly where it fell, would become one of the most important details in the entire case. Proof, in their argument, that the possibility of a pregnancy, and everything it threatened to unravel, gave both Sidney and Tammy Moorer a reason to want Heather gone. 15th Circuit Solicitor Jimmy Richardson later summarized the state's overall approach plainly. This was never a case resting on one undeniable piece of proof. It was, in his words, a combination of evidence. The defense looked at the same facts and drew an entirely different line. An affair, however messy, however public, is not a crime. Jealousy is not an abduction. Ugly text messages are not proof of what happened at 3:30 in the morning on a boat ramp 8 miles away. CTA. Motive versus proof. It would follow this case into every courtroom it touched for the next decade. And in 4 months, that argument would stop being theoretical, because investigators were about to find something in the Moorer's own backyard. Subscribe to Criminal Instincts with S-Day. Act 3 covers the investigation that had to build a case with no body, and the murder charge that ultimately couldn't survive that fact. No body, no weapon, no witness to a single violent act. Horry County investigators had to build this case out of something else entirely: digital exhaust, surveillance footage, and behavior that, taken alone, meant nothing. Taken together, prosecutors believed it added up to a pattern they could bring to a jury.
As Lieutenant Kegler said, we just want to give you an update on this case. I'll kind of start from the beginning for you. On December 19th, 2013, Heather Elvis's vehicle was found at the Peachtree Landing. On December 20th, when she was reported missing by her family, a full investigation was launched by the Horry County Police Department Major Crimes Unit. A 7-agency task force was then formed to investigate the disappearance of Heather Elvis. On February 21st, as a result of the investigation, a search warrant was conducted at the home of Sidney and Tammy Moorer. Sidney and Tammy Moorer were taken into custody and charged with 1 count of obstruction of justice and 2 counts of indecent exposure on the following day.
It started fast. December 20th, the day after Heather's car was found. Police arrive at the Moorer home, a 5-minute drive from Peachtree Landing. And near the parked camper in the yard, they find 3 things sitting together: a bag of concrete mix, a spent shotgun shell, a bottle of cleaning fluid. Officers ask about the home security system. Tammy tells them it isn't working. They ask about the black Ford F-150 in the driveway. She tells them it can't be unlocked right now. The very next day, December 21st, Sidney Moorer buys a brand new surveillance system. Not the broken one Tammy had described. A new one. It's that new system, installed within hours of police walking away, whose footage would eventually undo them both. According to testimony from Horry County investigator Peter Sester, that footage showed the Moorers washing their truck on December 22nd. Not a quick rinse. Hours of it. When I say extensively, it goes on for several hours of them cleaning the car, Sester testified. Tammy worked the passenger side. Sidney worked the driver's side. About 30 minutes in, a burn pile started in the yard nearby. Investigators would later conclude the cloth towels used to clean the truck were burned in that same pile. For investigators, one question still remained above everything else. Could circumstantial evidence like this, a truck wash, a burn pile, a broken alibi about a broken camera, actually stand up in a courtroom without a body to anchor it? Not every lead pointed toward the Moorers. In late January 2014, two men, a family friend of Terry Elvis and another local man, were separately charged with obstructing the investigation, accused of running their own parallel search and posting false information online. Neither, authorities eventually clarified, had any actual involvement in Heather's disappearance. Then, in early February, the case turned genuinely frightening for the Elvis family. Terry Elvis reported that two men in a passing car had shouted a threat at him. "We already have Heather. Morgan is next." Morgan being Heather's younger sister. Police searched for the vehicle. The men were later charged. On February 21, 2014, police executed a search warrant and took Sidney and Tammy Moorer into custody. Both were initially charged with indecent exposure and obstruction of justice. Kidnapping charges followed within days. 3 days later, on February 24th, Horry County Police Chief Sandra Rhodes announced the charge that made this a murder case. Both Moorers were now accused of killing Heather Elvis. They were held without bond.
Tammy Moorer were taken into custody and charged with 1 count of obstruction of justice and 2 counts of indecent exposure on the following day. On February 23rd, both Sidney and Tammy Moorer were charged with kidnapping in connection with the disappearance of Heather Elvis. On today's date, Sidney and Tammy Moorer will be charged with the murder of Heather Elvis.
For days after that, divers returned to search the boat landing itself, and investigators conducted what was described publicly as a forensic reenactment at the site. At a bond hearing months later, a judge asked prosecutors directly whether they had any direct evidence connecting the Moorers to Heather's disappearance. "Not at this time," the state answered. "But we do believe we have substantial circumstantial evidence." The judge granted bond $100,000 each in February 2015, more than a year after their arrest. By August, the Moorers had permission to relocate to Florida for work while the case continued, under monitoring conditions. A month after the arrests, a judge had already issued a gag order covering everyone connected to the case. A restriction one of the Moorers would eventually break in a moment that made its own headlines. Separately, investigators surfaced unrelated financial irregularities in the household, which later hardened into formal Medicaid fraud charges involving undisclosed business income on a 2007 benefits application. But the murder charge, the most serious count either Moorer faced, was the one place time actually worked in their favor. Without a body, without a weapon, without forensic evidence tying either of them to a specific violent act, prosecutors ultimately concluded they could not prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt.
The case, we've got to be really tight-fisted on all of that stuff, certainly not trying to deprive the public or the family or anyone else of any information. But right now, it could do a lot more harm than it could do good.
Now, both Sidney and Tammy Moorer are being held here at the J. Reuben Long Detention Center with further charges still pending.
On March 10, 2016, those charges were dropped against both Sidney and Tammy. The indecent exposure charges fell away as well. For Tammy, so did obstruction. What remained was kidnapping, a charge that, under South Carolina law, didn't require proof Heather had been physically restrained by force. It required only that she'd been lured, deceived into leaving safety under false pretenses. There was a person missing from all of this, easy to lose in the paperwork. A 20-year-old who, by every account from the people who knew her, had been looking forward to Christmas that year. Her family kept a stocking hung for her that December, and every December since. CTA. Decoy, not force. That single legal distinction was now the entire foundation the state's case would be built on. Someone would have to be tried on it first. And a Horry County jury was about to meet Sidney Moorer. Subscribe to Criminal Instincts with S-Day. Act 4 covers his first trial, and the lie about a payphone call that would eventually catch up with him.
Now, both Sidney and Tammy Moorer are being held here at the J. Reuben Long Detention Center with further charges still pending. But what those charges are, we're still waiting to find out.
June 2016. Sidney Moorer walked into a Horry County courtroom to face a jury for the first time, on the kidnapping charge alone, since murder had already been dropped by then. The prosecution's theory centered on motive. A man afraid of what a possible pregnancy might do to his marriage, luring Heather to Peachtree Landing through a payphone call he'd already been caught lying about once, on camera, before finally admitting it was his voice on the line. The defense pushed back with something simpler. Motive is not evidence, they argued. Cell tower data places a phone near a location, not a person at an exact spot. A truck sighting is an inference, not an identification. The jury deliberated across 2 days. Then, hours in, word came back. They couldn't agree. Judge Stephen John declared a mistrial. No conviction, no answers. Sidney Moorer walked out of that courtroom a free man. He would not stay one for long. More than a year later, in August 2017, prosecutors brought him back. This time on the obstruction of justice charge that had been waiting since his original 2014 arrest, built entirely around that same payphone call. The trial opened with roughly 3 hours of testimony, mostly from Horry County police officers, before jurors were sent home the first evening. The state's first and longest witness was Mike Melson, founder of a cell data analysis firm called Hawk Analytics, who walked the jury through cell tower records from both Sidney's and Heather's phones. Defense attorney Kirk Truslow fought hard to keep Melson's report out of the trial entirely, and, failing that, attacked its foundation directly on cross-examination. "What we have here is you coming in here and telling us what you read someone else wrote down," Truslow told him. The state's final witness was a relative of Tammy Moorer's, Don DeMarino, whose testimony the judge screened outside the jury's presence before allowing it. DeMarino testified that sometime after Sidney was released from jail, Sidney had shown him something on a cell phone that led him to believe Sidney knew more about Heather's whereabouts than he'd told investigators. DeMarino couldn't pin down exactly when this happened, and admitted under cross-examination that he hadn't come forward until he himself was later in jail on an unrelated charge.
To reach a conclusion, but not to assume that someone's guilty simply because they've been arrested and charged.
It's being put to me, if your client didn't do it, who did it? And that's a very bizarre thing to say.
This time, the jury didn't deadlock. 50 minutes of deliberation. Guilty, obstruction of justice. 10 years. The maximum sentence available. Judge R. Markley Dennis Jr. said part of his reasoning was to send a message to the community that people cannot hinder an investigation.
This has been there's been a long investigation. They have either a missing person or possibly a homicide. So clearly that's in the public domain, and that's what the focus of this has been.
"I'm not convinced that he's not convicted for kidnapping still," defense attorney Truslow told reporters afterward, "but it was called obstruction of justice." But that wasn't the end of the story, not for Sidney, and not for the charge that had started it all. 2 more years passed before Sidney faced a jury again, back on the original kidnapping charge. His defense fought hard to move the retrial out of Horry County entirely, arguing years of local media coverage had made an impartial jury there nearly impossible to seat. The request was denied. The retrial would happen exactly where the first trial had. Same county, same community that had spent years watching the story unfold on the evening news. While they waited, prosecutors hadn't been standing still. Going back through the Moorers' phone records with fresh eyes, they found, according to Assistant Solicitor Christopher Helms, A clearer, sharper pattern connecting the weeks after Tammy learned of the affair to the weeks leading directly into Heather's disappearance. That deeper dig gave prosecutors enough, in their assessment, to bring an entirely new charge against both Moorers: conspiracy to kidnap. By then, almost 4 years had passed since Peachtree Landing. For Thanksgivings, for birthdays, the reward fund the family had built in those first frantic weeks of searching still sat untouched, still waiting for a tip that would actually lead somewhere. Terry and Debbie Elvis had sat through a mistrial and a conviction that wasn't even for the right charge, and still no one could tell them where their daughter was.
Yes, that was established throughout the course of the investigation as well.
CTA. For the first time since the arrests in 2014, both Moorers would now be facing the exact same accusation, side by side, even if they'd stand trial separately months apart. One of them would face a jury first, and this time, prosecutors were bringing a piece of video evidence they believed could finally close the case. Subscribe to Criminal Instincts with S-Day. Act 5 covers Sidney's 2019 retrial and the piece of forensic video evidence that finally produced a conviction. September 2019. Sidney Moorer was back in a Horry County courtroom, facing the kidnapping charge for the second time. In his opening statement, prosecutor Chris Helms gave the jury a number instead of an argument. It's been 2,093 days since Heather Elvis could wrap her arms around her father. Helms told them. Nearly 6 years, counted out to the day. Defense attorney Bouchette asked jurors for something simpler in return: to hold the presumption of innocence for the length of the trial, whatever the pressure to deliver the Elvis family closure. Day 1 moved fast, 8 witnesses in a single sitting. Co-workers and Heather's own final date filled in the picture the jury would carry for the rest of the trial. A young woman shaken by a breakup, physically changing in ways her uniform no longer hid, out on what looked like a normal first date hours before she vanished. One that, by her date's account, they'd both expected to happen again. A phone company analyst then walked the jury through her final calls minute by minute, into the early hours of December 18th, turning the timeline from Act 1 into hard trial evidence.
Several witnesses were called to testify today in the case against Sidney Moorer in Horry County. Moorer is accused of kidnapping Heather Elvis. Elvis disappeared more than 2 years ago. One of the witnesses, a police sergeant, said Moorer lied. The sergeant said Moorer first told him he had not seen Elvis in 6 weeks, but later changed his story and said that he had seen Elvis the night before.
By day 3, the state turned to Sidney's own inconsistencies. A Horry County officer testified he'd called Sidney directly in the investigation's earliest hours, and that his answers about contact with Heather didn't line up. Former officer John Martin, who'd interviewed Sidney 2 days after the disappearance, described watching Sidney's story shift in real time. No contact, no contact, no contact. Then all of a sudden she's stalking him. Martin testified. He said Sidney's account changed the moment he was told investigators had video of him at the payphone.
Is that correct? Do you understand the gag order still follows, sir? And that is absolutely contrary to the gag order. It violates the gag order. There's no question about it. Now,
Day 4 came down to 2 beams of light. A South Carolina Highway Patrol trooper and forensic video analyst Grant Fredericks took the stand together, walking the jury through the headlights caught on the Peachtree Landing surveillance footage. The room waited. Prosecutor Nancy Livesay asked directly, "Did the vehicle match?" Fredericks answered in one word, "Yes." Then he spent nearly 4 hours explaining why. A comparison of headlight patterns across different truck models, frame by frame. The defense had an answer of its own. Forensic analyst Bruce Koenig told the jury there was no scientific way to prove the truck in the footage was the Moorers. The image, in his assessment, contained more differences than similarities to their actual vehicle. He conceded, based on Fredericks's underlying methodology, that the truck was likely a Ford F-150, just not necessarily theirs. Tammy's sister, who lived next door to the Moorers, testified for the defense as well, saying she'd received a text from Tammy confirming the couple got home at 3:10 a.m. Inside the window, the state argued they were at the landing. And then there was the GPS. Forensic examiners testified that the SD card inside the truck's navigation system had been removed at exactly 12:07 a.m. A single timestamp. No explanation offered for it at trial. The state would return to that number again and again in closing. Assistant Solicitor Christopher Helms laid out everything the state had gathered for the jury as plainly as he could. They were sitting in that courtroom, he told them, because Heather Elvis couldn't be. She would like to be there herself, he said, if she could. Defense attorney Casey Brown had a different way of putting it to the jury. The state, he argued, was trying to force a square peg into a round hole. The jury didn't see it that way. September 18, 2019. After roughly 2 weeks of testimony, guilty of kidnapping. 30 years. Sidney's conviction now stood. 6 years had passed. 6 Christmases. 6 birthdays. Heather's bedroom remained almost exactly as she'd left it. Her family still searched, still hoped, still lit candles at the same boat landing every December. But every courtroom victory came wrapped around the same unanswered question. A jury could decide who was responsible. No jury could tell the Elvis family where Heather was. CTA. 5.5 years after Heather Elvis vanished, prosecutors had now secured convictions against both defendants. In 2 separate trials, Tammy's the year before, Sidney's now. Assembled almost entirely from circumstance, the state's case had finally held up twice. But go back 1 year, and it hadn't been video or cell towers or a truck that decided Tammy's fate. It had been her own decision to speak. Subscribe to Criminal Instincts with S-Day. Act 6 covers Tammy Moorer's trial, and the moment she chose to take the stand against her own attorney's advice. October 8, 2018. Nearly 5 years after Heather Elvis disappeared, and almost a full year before her husband would even face his retrial, Tammy Moorer walked into her own trial. It would run 11 days, one of the longest the case would produce. Prosecutors opened by describing her as an angry, jealous wife who'd taken her husband's phone and, they told the jury, chained him to their bed at night once she learned of the affair. Defense attorneys reached for the same image that had followed this case for years. Their client, they said, was being forced into a role she didn't fit. A square peg pushed into a round hole.
Several witnesses were called to testify today in the case against Sidney Moorer in Horry County. Moorer is accused of kidnapping Heather Elvis.
Day 2 brought a witness who knew the Moorer family through her teenage son. Laura Garlitz, who testified Tammy had come by her house in early December to show off the family's new black truck, and that the 2 women had smoked marijuana together that night. After Heather disappeared, Garlitz said, Tammy described the affair to her in explicit terms, and later told her she had her own boyfriend. Someone, Tammy said, from a rock band. A cell phone data analyst who followed Garlitz testified that both Moorer's phones showed changed behavior in early November, right around when the affair was discovered, and had begun pinging near Heather's home and workplace even as all direct contact between them stopped.
Her feel like she was his one and only. She told me she loved him.
Sad, speechless. I mean, just nobody knows what to say. I mean, we kind of, we're praying for the best that Heather was still safe and alive somewhere, but we've obviously got news otherwise.
Investigators also played a recorded interview in which Tammy herself described her marriage to Sidney as open, a characterization the defense would lean on throughout the trial. In that same interview, an investigator produced a hotel key found in Heather's car and asked Tammy about it directly. By the 4th day, prosecutors called Tammy's cousin, Don DeMarino, the same man who'd testified in Sidney's 2017 obstruction trial. This time, his testimony went further. DeMarino told the jury Sidney had shown him a cell phone photograph of Heather at a family cookout, sometime after she was reported missing, and that in it, Heather did not appear to be able to walk or talk. DeMarino admitted he'd lied to his own mother about having seen it, and that he hadn't spoken to the Moorers since. The court restricted how far testimony could go in characterizing what the photo actually showed. For a moment, set the courtroom aside. Somewhere else in Horry County that same week, a stocking still hung in a house that hadn't stopped waiting. The 6th Christmas the Elvis family would spend without an answer. The rest of that week rounded out the picture from both sides. A defense witness placed the whole Moorer family together at a normal Christmas Eve gathering, days after Heather disappeared. A crime scene investigator testified the truck itself turned up no blood and no chemical residue. It simply smelled new. And a state missing persons coordinator confirmed the detail the prosecution would return to again and again. Nearly 5 years on, Heather had never renewed a license, applied for a new Social Security card, or contacted law enforcement in any way.
Dozens of people gathered outside the courtroom, some close friends of the Elvis family, others just there to show their support.
I think everybody in there was just absolutely heartbroken.
The state rested. The defense moved for a directed verdict, a request that the judge end the case right there, before it ever reached the jury, and for a mistrial. Both were denied. Then came a moment nobody in that courtroom saw coming. Tammy Moorer told the judge she wanted to testify. According to reporters covering the trial live, it drew an audible reaction from the room. Her own legal team, by most accounts, hadn't seen it coming either. The night before she took the stand, in direct violation of the gag order that had stood since 2014, she sat down for an interview with ABC News, denying any involvement and pushing back on the state's timeline.
These were Facebook posts, triple coupons, buy low, school's all done.
So it looks like you are putting together a timeline.
It starts with early in the night at 1:47, my sister texts me. 3:10, I pull into the driveway. I text her, I got the ad and that I'm home. 3:58, I make another post, and this is conversations that me and Sidney had that night. So I want to make sure that everything that I did was accounted for, that it's looking normal, just like any other day in my life.
I was surprised when Tammy Moorer decided to sit down with me for an interview in violation of a court-imposed gag order on her the night before she was expected to take the stand in her own defense and without her attorney present.
What we got accused of, neither one of us would ever do.
Which part?
The kidnapping. And at first it was murder as well, and we're not those kind of people. I've never even had a speeding ticket. I didn't even have sex till I was 18 years old.
There are people who say that you wore the pants in the family, that you were really the powerhouse here.
The man that makes the money is the one that's running the house. I paid the bills.
And the wife who gets her name tattooed on her husband's stomach,
That was
right
his
above
idea.
the belt,
That was his
seems
idea.
to be the one who makes the rules.
But that's making it sound like he got a tattoo because I forced him to, and I didn't.
Okay, so since we're on that subject, after he had the affair with Heather, did you actually handcuff him to
Never.
the bed?
Never.
It sounds like you're trying to hide or cover up something that seems completely natural, which is anger resulting from your
I'm
husband
not
cheating
mad
on
at
you.
her. I am pissed at him because he's not being honest with me.
Yet, the prosecution essentially alleged in the beginning that you were angry enough that your husband cheated on you, that you were ready to kill.
That's what they say. And they're wrong.
Were you angry enough that your husband cheated on you that you were ready to kidnap?
Absolutely not.
It seems that the prosecution to some degree thinks that you are the linchpin here, not Sidney.
They change it according to what they need to say.
It seems like everybody is lying here, except you.
And that's why I am terrified of tomorrow, because I feel like this town is going to crucify me because of all the lies and all of the that's happened.
On the stand, Tammy denied kidnapping Heather Elvis. She denied the murder allegation that had already been dropped years earlier. The defense's closing argument came down to a single, narrow stretch of time, the roughly 55 minutes between the end of Heather's last cell phone activity and a text Tammy had sent Sidney about dinner plans. In that short a window, the defense argued, there simply wasn't enough time to have abducted a 20-year-old woman and made her vanish without a trace. In closing, Assistant Solicitor Christopher Helms compared Tammy to a fairy tale villain. A portrait, in his words, of what happens when jealousy and deceit combine in someone consumed by fear of losing her husband.
I did. I didn't go about it the right way, and I'm sorry for that. It looks bad, but I just wanted to know who it was, that's all.
You've been known to use some pretty salty language, haven't you?
Right.
For hours of deliberation, guilty, on both counts. 30 years on each charge to run concurrently with credit for time already served. Months later, the jury's foreperson, Donna Marlowe, spoke publicly about what the deliberation had cost her. It was very hard for a lot of them, and especially for me, because I felt sorry for the kids, Marlowe said. She described nearly 3 exhausting weeks in the courtroom and watching Tammy from the jury box during her testimony. She kept on looking at me and smiling, Marlowe recalled. And I just, with a straight face, looked at her back. My next wish for this whole thing, Marlowe said, is for Heather to be found.
Well, Eric, Donna Marlowe was chosen to be the lead on that jury, and she says that it was about 3/4 through the trial that she knew her decision had to be guilty, something that she says made her sick to her stomach.
It was very hard for a lot of them, especially for me, because I felt sorry for the kids.
30 years for each charge of kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping.
It was very emotional. It was very, very, very emotional.
Jury foreman on Tammy Moore's trial, Donna Marlowe, says there was no comfort taken in sending a mother to prison, but it was something she says she knew she had to do.
Why do you do that? Because just in case you get caught, what's going to happen to your kids? They weren't thinking of the kids. They were not thinking of the kids. They were just thinking of Tammy, how Tammy felt.
Shortly after sentencing, through new counsel, Tammy announced she intended to appeal. CTA. She would get that appeal. But an appeal doesn't ask what happened at Peachtree Landing. It asks something narrower, whether the trial itself was fair. That question alone would take most of the next 6 years to answer, for both Moorers, in 2 courts that had never yet weighed in. Subscribe to Criminal Instincts with S-Day. The final act covers both Moorers' appeals, their 2025 bids for a new trial, and the question that still has no answer: where is Heather Elvis? A conviction does not close a file like this one. It opens a new one. Tammy Moorer's appeal was heard in late 2021. Her attorneys argued the trial judge had denied her a fair defense on 5 separate grounds: refusing a directed verdict, admitting sexually explicit text messages that also referenced drug use, allowing Grant Fredericks's forensic video testimony, excluding her mother and children as alibi witnesses over a procedural technicality, and excluding other defense witnesses for violating the courtroom sequestration order, the rule that keeps witnesses from hearing each other's testimony before they take the stand, after they'd reportedly followed the trial via livestream. Sidney Moorer's appeal, heard in April 2022, argued that his retrial should never have taken place in Horry County given years of local media saturation, that the state's case lacked direct evidence, and that Fredericks's headlight pattern testimony should never have been admitted as expert forensic opinion at all. On June 7, 2023, the South Carolina Court of Appeals ruled. Both appeals denied. In separate, detailed opinions, the court cited the same underlying pattern each time. Heather had never taken any of her belongings, had never used her closely guarded phone again, and had never resurfaced in any government or financial record since December 2013. It found Fredericks's video analysis had been properly admitted as a peer-reviewed forensic technique, and that neither the media coverage nor the contested texts had denied either defendant a fair trial. Both Moorers asked the South Carolina Supreme Court to take up their cases. Sidney's request was denied. Tammy's took longer. The state's highest court didn't issue its final denial until October 2024, nearly 11 years after Heather Elvis disappeared. With that, both Moorers had exhausted their direct appeals. It did not end there. In 2025, both Sidney and Tammy filed separately for post-conviction relief, a different kind of legal challenge, one that doesn't ask whether the trial judge made mistakes, but whether their own defense attorneys failed them at the time. Tammy's filing, submitted in October 2025, argued her trial counsel had been ineffective, failing to properly prepare witnesses, failing to call an expert who might have challenged the headlight pattern conclusion, failing to move to suppress the explicit text messages. She also alleged one of her original attorneys had asked her to sign a contract granting him book publishing rights to her case, a detail her new legal team has since described as an ethical conflict of interest. Sidney's filing, submitted in March 2025, asked for an entirely new trial in a different jurisdiction, alleging evidence of jury intimidation, withheld DNA evidence, and separately alleging that a relative of Heather Elvis had held a position within the Horry County Clerk of Court's office during his trial. A potential conflict of interest, he says, was never disclosed. Both filings remain pending. Neither has been resolved as of the most recent available reporting. 15th Circuit Solicitor Jimmy Richardson has noted publicly that post-conviction relief filings are a routine part of the appeals process. Not, on their own, evidence the original verdicts were flawed. Sidney and Tammy Moorer remain incarcerated, Sidney at Lee Correctional Institution, Tammy at the Women's Correctional Center in Columbia. His projected release date is March 31, 2044. Hers is May 9, 2043. Both would be well into their 60s before either sentence runs its course, if nothing changes between now and then.
I don't see how someone who is charged with murder at the end of the day should be allowed to leave the state.
I was beyond outraged when I heard it. I'm numb to it at this point.
Because you have to live every day without your daughter, so why should they have to?
Yes. It's to me, it's like rewarding them. I don't understand it.
Really heartbroken, sad, speechless. I mean, just nobody knows what to say. I mean, we kind of, we're praying for the best that Heather was still safe and alive somewhere, but we've obviously got news otherwise.
Every December 18th since 2013, people gather at Peachtree Landing. Same quiet ramp, same dark water, the same place a car once sat alone at sunrise, doors locked, engine cold, its driver gone. Heather's mother, Debbie, still comes here, still lights a candle year after year, in a spot the family now calls Heather's Garden. Her sister, Morgan, has spent the years since advocating for other families still waiting on their own answers. A payphone, a truck in the dark, 12 minutes no one can fully account for. That's where this started. More than a decade later, investigators can tell you exactly where her car was parked. They can tell you who called her and when. They can tell you where the phone records say that truck was headed. They can tell you who 2 separate juries believed was responsible. 2 people are serving 30-year sentences for kidnapping Heather Elvis. Both maintain their innocence. Both are still fighting those convictions in court. But no court record, no cell tower map, no piece of forensic video has ever been able to answer the only question that ever really mattered. The water at Peachtree Landing is still there. The candle is still lit every December. And Heather Elvis is still gone.
It's been looked at by so many people, by so many courts, by so many officials, and nothing has been slipped through the cracks. However, I do want to say that in a system where he is able to advocate and fight for himself, I just wish he had thought the same, that Heather might have wanted to fight and advocate for her life as well.
Final CTA. If you follow cases where the legal fight outlasts the headlines, and where some questions never quite get answered, subscribe to Criminal Instincts with S. Day.